Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Authors Guild event, Making the Switch from Academic to Trade Publishing. This is part of our series, Business Boot Camps for Writers, brought to you by the Authors Guild Foundation, with support from the National Endowment for the Arts, Penguin Random House, and our donors. We welcome Authors Guild members and any other writers out there in the audience. You're invited to visit authorsguild.org to learn more about what we do. And today, a special thanks goes to the Asian American Writers Workshop, who worked with us to develop this event. So today we have luminaries from the field, from the Academy and Publishing. We have Manan Ahmed, Associate Professor at Columbia University. He's a historian of South Asia and the littoral Western Indian Ocean world. Sharmila Sen, the author of the award-winning memoir manifesto, Not Quite White, and editorial director of Harvard University Press. Agent Wendy Strothman, founded the Strothman Agency in 2003 and a member of the Authors Guild Foundation Board. Hello, Wendy. Molly Turpin, senior editor at Random House, where her list includes scholars, journalists, and award-winning and best-selling authors. And Richard Thompson Ford will be moderating this conversation. The George E. Osborne Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. His most recent book was Dress Codes. Thank you for being here, Rich. To the audience, we have closed captions and a transcript available if you need that to follow along. There's a Q&A box. Please send any questions in at any time and we'll answer those toward the end, I believe. And of course, as always, please be courteous and respectful, and please do not solicit our panelists with queries or submissions unless invited to do so specifically. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Mr. Ford. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny, and thank you all of our panelists for coming to join us today. It's really exciting to be able to talk to you all about a topic of conversation that, I get asked about a lot. I've published some academic books and some books for trade presses, and a lot of people ask, well, how do you get into trade publishing? How did you do it? Is this manuscript that I have that's 1,000 pages long with lots of footnotes a good thing to send to Random House? And I can answer some of their questions, but not nearly as well as all of you can. So I'd like to turn it over to our panel to first just talk about the perspective on making the switch, on going from academic publishing, which looks very different in many ways, to trade publishing. Give us some perspectives on who should think about making that switch, what they should think about if they are contemplating writing for a trade publisher, and what some of the benefits are of moving from academic publishing to trade publishing. And I guess, Wendy, maybe I'll start with you. Wendy is my agent, and she is the person who helped me make exactly this transition. So what would you say to somebody who is pondering writing for a trade press, but so far has only written for academic presses or written academic articles?
Well, I think trade books, you have to think about the audience first. What does the audience want to know? What does the audience experience need to be? What will the audience care about, as opposed to what you want to say as a scholar, which might be interesting to you and a few colleagues, but not to your readers? And how will you hold the interest of readers for 200 or 300 pages to read something that they don't have to read professionally? So it's not just a matter of providing information, it's a matter of telling a story and thinking about suspense and plot and why something will resonate with a larger public today. So I think you it's not, yes, it's about what the presses are interested in, but it's mostly about what the readers will be interested in, the final reader. What will they care about, and how will your message be received by them?
Great. So it's thinking about a very different type of audience than people in the academy are often used to thinking about, and getting outside that kind of what you might describe as an ivory tower mindset, where I write about the ideas that are of interest to me and my 5 colleagues. Molly, maybe you could tell us a bit about what a large trade press is looking for, and how you deal with people who are moving from the academy to trade publishing.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I love working with scholars who are excited to talk to a larger audience beyond just their field and who feel that they have something to share that the larger world needs to know. I think what I look for when I'm reading a proposal, whether it's from Wendy or another agent, is why do I feel like I need to know this and need to read this now? Could I imagine myself picking this up as, you know, as one of the first readers of this book? Could I imagine myself picking this up in a bookstore and feeling a real urge that there's some either story or message here that I need to know? And I think for scholars especially, you know, you hold such expertise, and I think information that feels crucial to us all. But knowing when what you're writing about sort of crosses the threshold from moving just your field forward to really pushing ideas out in the world forward, and then like a broader discussion forward. Oh, you're muted.
Oops, I'm muted. That always happens at least once on a Zoom call. Glad it was me. So, so thank you so much. Sharmila, maybe you can tell us, because you kind of you're working in a category where you bridge the gap, perhaps between academic writing and trade writing. You probably get a lot of authors who are potentially doing one and moving to the other category. How do you think about the difference, and you know, maybe where would you place a book that you get? How would you decide whether to place it more in the domain of academic publishing as opposed to something that's reaching or crossing over into trade?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to go back to a word that Wendy just used, want. So, you know, I might be in the minority of people working in the book trade, in that I confess freely, I have no bibliomania. I'm a kind of person who doesn't think everything has to be a book. I consume lots of different kinds of media, you know, I mean, I love television, film, I read all sorts of things. So I always sort of begin with sort of, you know, why should this be a book? And then there's a kind of a bifurcation, and I will use Wendy's word want. For me, it's kind of very blunt, straightforward. In, you know, we do publish books for specialist academic audiences, and books that hopefully should appeal to a wide general readership beyond, you know, your immediate family and best friends and the 3 colleagues who promised you they will absolutely teach your book in the course. And that should be books people want, right? You know, the thing when it's such a simple thing, like a great trade book should be a book people want. And for me, a great academic book, because I think, you know, it's what makes a good academic book is also important. I think that's the kind of background against which we are talking when we talk about this transition, is it should be a book people need. And I often say, and if your book is neither something people want nor need, other than you need it, it might not be a book for me. And it's absolutely right. You have to, if you want to write for the general reader, the trade audience, the book has to go to the reader. I often have a kind of very frank conversation with authors about the price of things, you know, and I think, you know, imagine this book at $29.95 and you buy it for, say, I don't know, $27 on Amazon. What else can somebody do with that money? You know, I mean, I can get, you know, maybe 3 large pizzas, I can buy a pair of jeans, I can go to a, you know, a modest dinner. And I have people think about this thing, what I think of, you know, what you owe somebody, you know, who's willingly giving that up. And it's not something that often academics think about, because it's not something, you know, a professor with a very fancy research account is buying. It's not something that a library is buying, you know, it's a human being. And what do you owe them, you know, which is a kind of way of Manans here. So, you know, I'm just going to sort of code switch for a second and say, in the part of the world I come from, you know, in movie making, we call that pesa vasul, which is getting your money's worth. And that might sound a little brutal, but I think it's also something that sort of kind of ties into, there is an ethic to what you should be offering a trade audience. And it's helped lots of authors to think that way.
Great, thank you. So yeah, it's not, and we were often in this situation in the academy where we are assigning readings to students, let's say, and although even then we want to give them something that they need or hopefully want, it's a somewhat different relationship when you're talking about a consumer who doesn't, you know, have to read your book. Manon, so you've made this shift, or you're writing in both the academic vein and for trade presses. How did you make this shift, and how do you think about the differences between the two types of work?
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to Authors Guild for hosting this important conversation. I have all of the questions that anyone else might have on this transition, so I'm really glad to be here. And of course, Sharmila is the person who published me as my editor. So I just wanted to kind of take her kind of exposition on want and say, for many of us in the academy, we also want to keep our jobs. And the way the academy is structured is that in order to keep our jobs, if we're lucky enough to have it in the first place, which is again a question of the market, we are required to publish. We're required to publish academic scholarly work, most of the cases, especially if you're in a research institution. And even if not, there's a lot of kind of prestige creep or a lot of kind of overreach by institutions in order to build up their brand. And so for a lot of academic authors, there is simply no choice until a moment in their career, whether through tenure or through other means, they can actually think of an audience other than their departmental and divisional colleagues who will vote on their tenure, right? So it's kind of a necessity for us to publish in venues that would, you know, our field is the assumed audience, but really the people who are voting on our files are the 5 people, as you mentioned, someone mentioned a minute ago. However, so if that's the kind of market that determines academic publishing for a majority of people, like I said, pre-tenure or those who are lucky enough to have a tenure track, after that, for some folks, I think there is an opportunity to want to speak to someone larger. Maybe they feel that their question or their approach or their research has significance and they themselves have the merit to make that kind of transition in writing or in thinking. And I think there's also a pressure lately, I want to say since 2008 perhaps, about, you know, saving the humanities, which means that we are supposed to speak outside the ivory tower in order to do that saving. And there are barriers to entry. If you are a person of color, if you're a woman of color, if you belong to any ethnicity and backgrounds that is not the color of the publishing industry or of that even the academy for that matter, those saving the humanities spaces are not designed or hospitable to those kinds of diverse voices. So I think there are both kind of pressures from the academy. There are pressures from the ways in which scholars who are in the humanities and the social sciences are thinking of the public. The public looks very different for someone like me who works on a region very far away and in a time period very far away. I'm not writing a history of Manhattan. I can't just speak about the Republican Party and whether or not it's really good or is it really fascist. None of those things are gonna be my entry point into the public. So all of those are barriers to entry. It means that some people get to enter public and imagine that public much easier than other people.
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to shift gears, but it picks up on something that you were just talking about in terms of how you present your ideas, and that's writing style. And you know, there's often in writing, in academic writing, or at least this is the stereotype, but I think it's justified in many cases, jargon and very dense writing and writing that's somewhat impenetrable to people outside a fairly select club. And that may be the kind of writing that's necessary in order to get tenure and to get prestige within the academy, but maybe it doesn't work so well when you're trying to speak to people outside the academy. So I'd just like to pose the question to anyone who's interested in answering, and you know, I'll call on someone if no one does, but what should writers thinking about moving from academic writing to writing for a more popular audience think about in terms of their writing style? How should they alter their writing style? What are the ways to think about writing less formally or with less kind of impenetrable academic jargon? Wendy.
I once had a young scholar come visit me after she'd written a proposal, and I read a sentence out loud to her. And I said, I want you to tell me what this sentence means. She'd written it. And she looked like a deer caught in the headlights. She had no idea what it meant. And she said, I didn't used to write this way. And I said, well, don't. I don't think you need to dumb the ideas down, but you need to think about, picture yourself, in the day when we went, and maybe we will again, go to a cocktail party, and you're trying to describe what you do to somebody, and you each have a glass of wine in your hands and you're explaining it. Are they going to just drift off because they have no idea what you're talking about? Or are they going to get gripped by what you're telling them? I mean, I think a good writer can make almost anything be interesting. We talk about, faraway places. I had no idea I was interested in the Hmong people of California and their medical problems until Ann Fadiman wrote The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. I had no interest in that subject, but then I couldn't put the book down. So how do you grab the reader? By telling them a story. You don't need to use jargon. And somebody once said, when the concept gets complicated, the language should get simple. The sentences should get shorter. Let the reader breathe. And I think people like to write these long sentences and look smart, but then the person is drifted off to the other side of the room.
Yeah, that's great. Molly, were you about to jump in? It looked like you were.
I was just going to add, I think I agree with everything Wendy said. Like, I sort of think, like, imagine talking to a friend who is not in academia, like a smart friend who is not necessarily an academic or in your field. But I would also just add, like, maybe before you write the proposal, or even think about the trade book that you'd like to write, think about what practice you can get. And this can come in the form of writing op-eds or essays for places like Slate or the New York Times or wherever you can get in. And as Manon noted, you do have to, I think, be mindful of your career and what your department feels about writing outside of academic spaces. But I think that can be a really great way to begin to talk to an audience that is not academic. And honestly, it's also just going to help you down the road, because as publishers, we love to see that you have, those relationships. They're not required, but they can be really helpful to know that you've written for places and for a non-academic audience, because that only helps with the promotion of your book down the line.
Yes, thank you. I could bring those two comments together with a little story. I kind of cut my teeth working with someone named Henry Fender, who now is writing for an editor at the New Yorker. But he said something much like what Wendy said, which was, you're writing an op-ed, you want to get the New York Times to publish it. Your readership hasn't had a cup of coffee yet, Rich. So that sentence, you've lost the reader halfway through. No coffee, don't forget. But it was both of those together. You're getting that experience writing something that can't be more than 800 words and trying to grab someone who doesn't need to read what you're saying and isn't in the academy. Anyone else with thoughts about that, about how you deal with the writing style?
Sure. I'll jump in a little bit and build on this. With jargon, absolutely. And and I tell my authors, the problem with jargon, for me at least, not that it's always incorrect, that it's smelly bowling shoes. It's unimaginative. It's walking in someone else's shoes. That's what jargon is. At some point, we can always do that kind of deep dive and find that some clever guy in 1969 originally used a particular turn of phrase in my former literary criticism field, and then it got translated from French into English, and then everybody thought, and then at some point in the 90s, you just thought, like, if you just always do this, you'll just automatically sound smart. It's a kind of signaling thing, so it's unimaginative. There's also voice, and I think it's possible to have many voices. You don't have to be one person. I will perhaps offer a note of caution about the op-ed, which is to say, I think that's great practice. But an op-ed voice can be extremely annoying in book length form. So you have to also understand, like, what works for like a sort of 100-page tight, in your face, polemical short book writing will be annoying as hell if you try to carry that for like 300 pages, right? And an op-ed voice there, and there's not one successful way to write an op-ed, but we all, I think, know when we've read one that we've enjoyed what we enjoy about it. But it's also something about its shortness, its form. So beginning to have some understanding that it's the subject, it's the length you want to write. You know, do you want to write that kind of grand synthetic big book? Do you want to write a short book? Is it a kind of how to? Anyways, there are lots of, we're talking about trade books as if there's only one thing that's a trade book. So I think getting into that helps. And as I said, keep having different voices, you know, that you can be for sometimes for women and younger women, you know, I push my authors, say, put your big girl pants on. For writers of color, which has, you know, that's a whole other conversation of how to kind of get that, a certain kind of easy authority in your voice. And there's a reason why it's a lot of work sometimes for many of us to develop that, right? And not to think of academic and trade writing as a kind of something along a teleological field, right? Like you're just kind of, you start academic, then you go trade, then you go bigger and bigger and bigger until you've written that book that everyone in the world has read. I mean, come on, that's that's not how life works. And I think it's possible careers move crabwise as much as they move in a kind of straight line, because otherwise it's this kind of narrative of triumphalism, right? That like some sort of academic writing is your like prep to trade writing, which is your prep to, I don't know, writing for Netflix one day.
That's great, thank you. In order to get into trade publishing, you need a literary agent. And a lot of people in the Academy don't know that, but there is a very different way to get those books picked up. And so I'd like to talk a bit about that. And first of all, I guess, Wendy, I'll just ask you, how should people go about finding an agent, and how should they approach a potential agent?
I think a really good, first of all, I don't think you can write trade books unless you read trade books. If you don't know what's out there and you've never read trade books, you're probably not going to be able to write a good trade book. So I suggest to people that they look at books that they admire, trade books, we're talking nonfiction mostly. So it's going to be books that have acknowledgments in them. Look at the acknowledgments section of books in your field and books that you admire, and see who the agent is. Usually, you know, if the agent's not thanked, that's a sign itself, but usually the agent is thanked. So, you know, you're going to see the same agent's name often show up, or different agents' names show up. So that's one starting place. You know, you could subscribe to Publishers Marketplace, but maybe you could get it through your library and look at the deals section and see, you know, who represents your friends, or you can figure out who represents your friends. Then you should go to the agent's website and look at the agent's website, because most of us have instructions on the website for how to query us. And we think if you can't read directions, we're not sure you're going to make a good author. So the worst thing to do is to try to call us. Back before the pandemic, you know, people would want to have coffee with you. You know, time is money for an agent. We don't have time to have coffee, and we don't have time to bat ideas around. Like, I have 5 ideas for a book, you know, help me. You know, I can do that for a current client whom I care about and who I have a relationship with, but not somebody who just comes in off the street. You've got to have a passion, and I have to sense that you have to write this book, or you have 2 books you're thinking about, but you have to write this book, and you're going to go the distance. So you need to show that. I'd say write a short query email, you know, a couple of paragraphs giving your credentials, what the book is, why it's important, and don't include an attachment, but have the proposal ready to go should we ask to see it.
Thank you. And you know, I mean, that leads to another point, which is the proposal, because often in academic publishing, people submit an entire manuscript, but for trade publishing, we submit proposals. Does anyone want to jump in about that, about what makes a good proposal, and or how you've written a proposal that was successful, or and you know, and then also what makes a bad proposal, or one that's unlikely to work? Okay, I'll call on someone in just a minute. Let me, oh, Molly, great. It looks like you're gonna.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think, I get asked this question sometimes actually by agents, like, what do you want to see in a proposal? And it's a hard question to answer because there's no one formula for writing a great proposal. I think, often it has some kind of an outline, maybe some sample of the writing. We want to get a sense of the voice. But for me, a really good proposal, and this is going to sound very vague, but it gives me, like, it's a document that makes me trust you, that makes me trust that you're going to be able to pull this book off. So I want some sense that I can see roughly how you're going to get from point A to point B, which is from the beginning to the end of the book, and that you not just have the credentials to write in the expertise, but a sense of how you want to tell this story or make this argument. That doesn't mean that your outline has to be set in stone. The structure may change as we have a conversation or as you get into writing the book, but it's coming away with a faith in this author that they can pull it off. And sometimes that's happened for me with a 25-page proposal, and sometimes it's happened for a 100-page proposal, and it can really run the gamut. But I think that's sort of, you want to convince somebody that you have the goods, as Wendy said, to make this book work.
Thank you. Manon, could you tell us a little bit about how you go about writing a proposal, or what how you think about that when you have an idea?
I mean, I think this might also kind of tie into the conversation previously, on the previous question, but I think within the academic world, in the academic environment, there are, like the real world, if we want to make that distinction, there are different forms of writing that we all practice. So yes, one form of writing looks like our scholarly articles or books, but I write a lot more kind of committee memos than I write scholarly books at the moment. So I know how to be really boring, and I know how to make a point. That's not the issue. You learn those things. But I think the proposal or approaches, query letters, there is a type of kind of imagining of the market that perhaps is not always visible to the authors. And that's where I think perhaps an agent is useful in order to kind of shape the way in which someone might want to go about imagining that world. I am part of Columbia University Press's faculty publishing committee, so I read a lot of proposals that come to the Columbia University Press, which has sort of different kinds of imprints. One of them is kind of trade-ish. And so you do see a wide array of writing styles and a wide array of, let's just call it privilege operating in those documents. I've seen 3-page proposals that are basically about a senior faculty member's hut in southern France, and what are the types of trees he can see from his yard, and it's just a description, and everyone is like, this is beautiful, evocative, I want to read 300 pages of it, and I'm like, this is crazy, but all right. And there are others who are perhaps really, really kind of well-researched and well-written proposals, but they appear to be too niche or too narrow or perhaps too laborious to get through. So I think this is a skill set. I think it requires help. I think it requires a community of other authors, perhaps other friends. And I think the advice about acknowledgements is exactly correct. As you want to read what you want to publish first. You want to read those books, and then you want to read those acknowledgements. You want to see what that network is. And maybe that gives you some ways into it, but that would be the kind of, I think, sort of approach that I think would be really useful.
Great, thank you. I want to shift a little bit to talk about the differences between academic presses and trade presses. And Sharmila and Molly, I think you could speak to this first question, but what are the major differences in terms of what you're looking for and what what the right way is to submit something? I mean, I've already touched on some things, like you don't submit a full manuscript in many cases to trade presses, but if you just give us some sense of the biggest differences, so that someone coming from the academic world would think, okay, here's what's going to be different if I want to submit something to a trade press.
I mean, I'm curious to hear what Sharmila has to say about this, because I think for Random House, the biggest thing is having an agent really is key. I think we really only acquire projects that are agented, and it's hard for me to think of ones who aren't. And you know, I think with that does come advice, as Manon said, about what the market is and they can help you because they will know us. You know, the thing about having an agent is we know agents and they know us, and that's all part of our jobs. So they have a sense of what they're looking for and finding the right person for your project, which is really a huge thing. It's just making that that editor-author partnership work, and that's what agents are great at. I don't know. Can you say more about what it is you're looking for? Say more about your question, I think is what I'm asking.
Oh, well, what I'm just getting at, that's a great part of the answer, but you know, are there other things that people should really think about in terms of the process of submitting their work? One, it needs to come through an agent. Anything else that's going to be a surprise to someone coming out of academic publishing and going into trade publishing that they really ought to know? Or is it just the case that, well, once you have the agent's going to let you know all of those things?
I think I mean, the basics are first, as Molly said, first, remember, I mean, for a great majority of commercial publishers, without an agent, there's no entry. So really what your first step is, find yourself a good agent. And a good agent will, after you've, you know, scoured the acknowledgements and hopefully the internet. Wendy, it occurs to me like a lot of authors who are new to this wouldn't know, you know, because not everyone says, and thanks to my agent, so-and-so, it could be with the, so just, but, you know, use your brains, cross-reference, it'll start becoming clear, why does this person's name keep coming up? And maybe Google them and you'll see, you know, they're an agent. So getting yourself an agent, and, you know, on the other side, we can also tell how an agent values a submission based on the quality of the submission. Some submissions seem pretty clearly the agent spent all of 15 minutes and the expectations are, you know, judged accordingly. And some people have really had their agent work with them. You know, the polish shows there. For university presses, you do not need an agent necessarily, although you can also, an agent can also submit. But I think the big difference, Molly, just like, you know, if you kind of think, if you've done the university press route and you want to get published by PRH, okay, get yourself an agent. What if you are, this is a rarer case, but what if you've published in non-university press and for some reason, and this does actually happen, sometimes for all sorts of reasons, people want to come publish with a university press. 2 words, peer review. That is something that most people haven't had to work with, right? On the other side. So there's this whole other layer, peer review and some form of a faculty board approval process. It varies from press to press, but there's some version of it in almost everywhere, right? So I think it's just really important to understand that these are the basic steps. And to me, those are the 2 main differences. Everything else I think is the same. I would say, you know, I fully expect everyone to Google stalk us before they submit. And, you know, if you're going to put the effort into either reaching out to an agent or to an editor directly at a university press, do your homework, research, find out. And remember that pitch letter that you're writing, I'm just looping back to that earlier thing, just remember who your audience is. You know, this is just true for all kinds of writing. You know, it's a piece of occasional writing. There's an occasion for which you're writing your pitch letter. Your audience is either the editor, or if you're at the prior stage and you're trying to get yourself an agent, it's the agent. It's not people in your field. And it seems very obvious, but I think a lot of people forget that, right? So editors and agents, we're not stupid people, but we're not also reading every single footnote in your favorite journal. And we're reading a lot of stuff. So if you think about who I am or who Molly is or who Wendy is, and you are imagining or versions of us out there, and that's who you're writing that pitch letter for, I think your chances, the probability of meeting with some success is increased.
Yes, thank you. Wendy.
I would go back to the time is money for those of us who work for ourselves, but I think even for editors, is that our time is so limited. We have so many books on our table at any one time that you need to lead with your best foot. And you may be so excited and you may want me to drop everything and read this tomorrow, but I might not be able to. So keep in mind that the agent and author relationship is going to be intimate for many, many years if it goes well. And even for you and your editor, and you want to demonstrate that that you're somebody that I'd like to work with. You know, if somebody comes across, excuse me, as a jerk, I think my life is too short. I'm not, I'll let somebody else handle this. It may be a great project. So you have to be polite. You have to think about what the other guy's responsibilities are at the time, and just lead with your best foot, as you would in a job interview, as opposed to meeting somebody on the street.
Great, thank you. That's great. Another thing that is often worried about is that the publishers may not only be looking for the project, but also for buying the author in some sense, in terms of their connections, in terms of whether they're on social media and what have you. And so I wonder if people could speak to that set of questions, like, do you need to be on social media? Do you need 500,000 Twitter followers? Is that more important than, for instance, how you're received in your field when you're making the transition from academic to trade publishing? What about publishing, op-eds or having a footprint out, already in other forms of media? So anyone who's had an experience with that or who has opinions about that, I'd love to hear that.
I think it's important. It's one data point, though. I think we can all here name very successful trade authors whose Twitter followings are modest to none, and people who have frankly not succeeded with their trade books. And we know the numbers, who have massive Twitter followings, right? So it's one data point. I think it's not proven yet, how the followers to books actually sold, what the conversion rate is, and there are many factors that go into it. I think the other thing, at least, in our own internal discussions, this is a discussion I have with my colleagues and my editors, is there's a kind of a misunderstanding. I think it's fairly simple word, but what platform means. A few op-eds written to me is not a platform. That means you have maybe some media presence or media experience, right? A platform is a column, is a super successful podcast, or that's a platform. Versus, sometimes people just sort of write. They have done, one op-ed here, a couple of pieces in, kind of LARB, NYRB kind of thing, and that's platform. I think that's a misunderstanding of what sort of in the general world, what platform means, and how that, particularly for books, and how that can be used by a good marketing team to get some attention for a book.
Great. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Molly?
I agree with that completely. I think a Twitter following and experience writing in popular places can be helpful, but they are not required. They're, as Sharmila said, they're one data point. I think the only thing I would add is that for every project, I want to know that you are the person who has to write this book, that you are the expert on it, because with that, we can help you. A good trade press can help you make the case for why you should be listened to, for why, if you haven't had that experience before, why now is the time to break you out and introduce you to the public as the person who we should all be listening to on the subject of your book. And so one thing on judging and proposals is also, this might be a great idea. This might be like an incredible argument, but is this actually the person to write this book? And with academics, of course, you may have spent your entire working life on this. So you have a great case to make that you are somebody who is worth listening to.
Thanks. Another question, this comes after the book is published, but book promotion, what should authors expect or expect to need to do in order to promote their books? Are there still book tours where people fly around the country and talk in bookstores? And if not, what's the alternative to book tours? Everyone's shaking their head on book tours. But I think a lot of people have this kind of idea in their mind that may be outdated about what publicity looks like.
I mean, we were all shaking our heads, so I think we all sort of know that the reality is that book tours just very rarely happen these days, partly for budget reasons. And even before the pandemic, they were really kind of on their way out. And I think, I think for authors, events can be really valuable, but it really depends. You have to think about like what it is you're getting out of that event, because I will tell you, it's usually not book sales. It can be great engagement with readers. It can be a wonderful conversation. It can be an excellent event. I often think it's more for the author than it really is for the promotion of the book. That doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. It can be so great, but the things that we use like that move the needle are often things that are frankly like national media. In the case of nonfiction, it's often publicity. So I wouldn't, if you are working on a trade book, I wouldn't worry about bothering your publicist about setting up more events. They will do it for you if you bug them enough, but they won't love it. And it's not going to necessarily help your book sales. What I think a better use of their time and energy, and every book has a publicist, if you're working with Random House, if you're working with a big trade publisher, is making sure that that book is getting in the hands of people who have megaphones.
Great. Thanks. Wendy?
I also say to my clients, the publisher will do only as much as you do. You can't assume that if you go to a trade house that everything will be taken care of and you can just sit back and let the events and the ads and everything roll in. Most publishers don't even have print advertising budgets anymore. And the tours don't happen. So you have to be building up your relationships with potential blurbers and having those endorsements come in early so that the publisher can think, yeah, I did make the right decision in buying this book. Look at all these people who are waiting for it. You want to make the publisher feel good about you and the book. So you want their sales force to be excited about it when they go out to bookstores because you've gotten endorsements lined up. And you don't want to be, the old expression, you don't want to tell your grandmother how to suck eggs. So don't say, are you going to send this book to the New York Times book review? They probably know that they should do that. So you want to be there and be present for them, but not be a nudge at the same time.
Any other thoughts?
I agree. I mean, I think there is a phenomenon, Molly, you might see this where, sometimes people, whether it's on the socials, they'll see a colleague or a frenemy or what have you, post a little visual, right? A little Twitter card of their book tour. And it just seems like some people are having it. I want it too. The book tour is a little bit like the launch party, a thing that you haven't brought up, but perhaps few people are, and it's not that none of these things happen. I mean, but you have to be a writer whose books are selling at a particular level, right? For some of those things to be going on. And it really is hard those are not really, as Molly said, the sales event, the bookstore events and stuff. They could be good for other things, building relationships with the store and so forth. The only exception I can think of, and again, I don't know who's in this audience for the webinar, but there is a kind of author for particular kinds of trade books where you have kind of corporate events, okay, which is a little different from the beautiful indie bookstores around the country event that people often are showing off about on Twitter. And that's where you go to, some big, to Microsoft, and they have 500 people in the audience and they've all bought a book, right? And your publicist and your sales team will work with you. Those are special sales that, there's a way in which that's driving a certain kind of they're not organic sales per se, but it does actually help. And there are other things you can, if you're interested in being a partner, I want to emphasize this thing. Wendy said that you have to be a partner, you got to hustle, but not be a pain, right? So it's a delicate dance that can be done, and which is also trying to help drive the pre-orders, right? And listen, ask your editor, your publicist what you can do, and do what they're telling you to do, right? If they ask you to get up, so if you say I'll do everything, and sometimes, an op-ed or some little piece interview comes around and you're going to have 48 hours. That's it, because journalism has a different kind of metabolism than the book publishing industry. Your metabolism has to change, because if you say I'll do it, but like in 1 month, that opportunity is gone. So
Yeah.
Those are some little things I can think of being a good partner with your publisher.
I think that's exactly right. And to add to both your and Wendy's points, like Wendy's completely right. We probably know already to send the book to the New York Times and to, to our own media contacts, but we also don't know who's in your network. And so always, and we're not going to know that until you tell us. So just on the theme of being game, frankly, like be game for the process, bring a list. And it doesn't have to be, other best-selling authors or people who themselves have a big megaphone, but bring a list of people who are experts, like people who you think will rally to the book, who might be your friends in the field, who might be your friends. Maybe you have a journalist friend somewhere who might not be on our list to send to. Those are things that can be really helpful for us to know, because, that's where the work starts.
There's a thing called the author questionnaire, authors, just reminding you, it will sometimes feel like, what the hell is this form at the end of a long, torturous process of having finished your book, looked over your, maybe you're looking at proofs and you might want to kind of skip it or do it when you're half asleep. Please don't. Make yourself a strong cup of coffee and fill out that, because that is the start of a lot of good things that could happen for your book that the marketing team could look at. I think a lot, especially in academia, I think people, often are not talking about the author questionnaire. So, and university presses use them too. So just, that's a little tip.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we have about 10 minutes left, and so maybe it's time to take a few Q&A from the audience. And oh, Johnny, do you want to handle this, or should I just start to read off of the chat?
Oh, sure. I've been looking through it. So a few people have asked, why make the jump? What if they're happy with their university press? The university press is large and does some marketing. What would any of you say to that?
If you're happy with your press, don't change.
And Wendy, do you look at the sales for your academic books? Are you interested in how well someone's academic books have sold?
No, I mean, if somebody comes to me with a really, really poor trade sales track record, that can be one thing we have to pay attention to when we go out with a new submission. And sometimes people do well to be switching publishers at that point. But if a university press book hasn't sold that well, it doesn't really matter.
I agree with that. Like, I'll just say, having been in the internal conversations at a big trade press, we do look at those numbers, but we look at them differently than we might look at like a trade sales track, because we understand that like the marketing and the people and institutions that are buying those books, it's just a different audience.
We've talked about querying agents and submitting proposals to publishers. I think it might help if we sort of define the difference between that. Is it the same thing with a different cover letter? Does the agent help shape the proposal? Is there a difference between the query and the proposal?
Oh, yeah. And the query is a short letter to get me to want to read the proposal. And the proposal is going to be a document, as Molly says, 25. I never go over 40 pages. I guess I have a short attention span, but 25 to 40 pages that we have a marketing section. We have a, why this book, a sources section. So I might go through 5 or 6 drafts with a client before I send a proposal up, because it's often about shaping how the story is going to get told and what the structure of the book will be. So, so what I submit to Molly is going to be very different, or Sharmila is going to be very different from what came to me. I want to know at the early stage that I think you can go the next few steps. That first query and the first draft of the proposal has to show me that there's something there to work with.
We talked about writing to a popular audience instead of to your academic colleagues, but does a trade book really need to appeal to everyone, or should the author be focused on finding a niche audience?
It doesn't need to appeal to everyone. In fact, we'd rather you don't say, in your proposal, like, this book is for everybody, because that also means it could be for nobody. If you have a sense, as I think everybody has been saying here, and Wendy especially, like, if you have a sense of the books that you admire and that are like the book that you want to read, that gives us a sense of who the audience is. If it's the audience of, I'm just thinking about this because I published a book about John Maynard Keynes, but if it's the audience for, like, Lords of Finance, that gives me an idea of who the reader is versus a different book. And that's often how we are thinking about, for better or worse, and this is a conversation that I think is happening all over publishing, but we are often looking at what we call comp titles, like comparable books, and who their audiences are, and how your book, the book of any of the book that will come from any proposal, where it's going to fit on the shelf, essentially.
I think for authors, it's good to know how publishers think about, comp titles, or as Molly said, for the reader of blank, or it's like Frasier for the viewers of Cheers. It's kind of common sense. For a writer, though, there's, before you go to find an agent, or before you're thinking of your next new book, there's another way. It's a little different from what the publisher is doing, which is, I like for people to think about, I myself think about, kind of a barrier to entry. Do you need to have a degree in law? Do you need to have a PhD? Do you need to have a bachelor's degree? Can a 17-year-old read this? Like, I think about what you need to know already to get into this, which is different from this book is for everybody, but for a certain kind of nonfiction, it helps you understand how you're going to have to write it, right? What you can expect people to know, what you have to kind of bring to them, and kind of weave it in. These are slightly different things, but it does come together. And again, look at what we said at the beginning. Look at the kind of books that you admire. What do you want your book to be like? And then kind of reverse engineer that and think, what did somebody need to know to get into that book, right? And then you might be kind of being able to figure out what your register should be, right? Where you pitch it at.
Can anyone speak to the market for memoir and biography these days? We've had many questions about what's selling in that field. Is a biography of an unknown person something that really has a chance, or a memoir of a non-famous person?
Pretty tough. And I mean, I think it's all in the quality of the writing. If it's something that so just blows you away, you think about a book like H is for Hawk, where you thought, whether you liked it or hated it, that was language you could chew on. You couldn't, I couldn't put it down. I had never heard of her before I read that book. So if it's a book that's so beautifully written, but so many memoirs of people who aren't well written, or, they're just not going to go anywhere, at least in my estimation.
I think that's completely right. The burden is just on the writing entirely, and the story. It all kind of has to come together, because then you're leaning not on your credentials, but on just what's on the page.
Others have asked about writing books for the trade on ground they've already covered academically. Maybe it's a dissertation that's available publicly and free in databases, but they could write it differently for a mass audience. Is that a problem for agents or publishers to tread the same waters?
I mean, you have to reveal something in the trade book that wasn't in the dissertation. If the dissertation is based on new research that got some attention, that's harder than if the dissertation was really narrow and you can broaden it. You can broaden I mean, I've done a number of revised dissertations as I don't know that they were necessarily published before, but they were revised dissertations, so they're available. But they were completely rewritten by the time they became trade books.
Another way of thinking about it, Johnny, is, I mean, I think maybe this is not the question, but it's also about popularization, right? So if you've done a kind of more specialized study of X, and now you want to write that for a broader audience, can you do that? We see that all the time. And it makes me think of another kind of, to my mind, a pretty basic difference between scholarly publishing and commercial publishing, when we were talking about the differences, agent, peer review. And that is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is the kind of obsession with novelty and newness in scholarly writing, because that's sort of what academia is, coming from academia. I know that it's the push to have to produce something new research, right? Sometimes, in-house, jokingly, I say filling much needed gaps in scholarship. But, commercial writing, its successful trade books aren't always the first to say something, right? Think about it. But it's how it's said. The how is as if not more important, right? Whereas I think in the university press world, often, we're sort of, because we are closely linked to the academy, it's about, this is new research. Nobody has discovered this. Nobody has gone to this archive. Full confession, sometimes I wonder if we lean a little too much on the novelty or the newness, and kind of end up sacrificing some of the art of the telling. But thankfully, there are lots of different kinds of publishers who can focus on the art of the telling.
Thank you. Well, we can wrap up shortly. It's about 5 now, but many in the audience are also wondering exactly how wealthy they will become by publishing with the trades. But really, is there a specific difference they should know to expect for the advance in the royalties, how the payment works, the odds of earning out the advance and getting royalties, that sort of thing?
Don't quit your day job. To be serious, the advance comes in parts. Molly can.
We pay out our advances. The standard advance payment is paid in quarters. So you will receive a quarter of your advance on the signing of your contract, a quarter when we accept your manuscript. That means putting it into publication, into production, sending it to the copy editor. The next quarter on publication, and then the final quarter a year after it. So, if you receive, let's say, a low 6-figure advance, like $100,000, that's $25,000. Then you take 2 years to write the book, and that's another $25K. Then maybe it takes another year for the book to come out. So I wouldn't want to be living on that money. And the size of advances I can't comment on, because I think they just vary wildly, and the reasons for the variance also vary. Whether it's you are fortunate enough to have your book go to a big auction, and so the numbers just get crazy. Or maybe, maybe one editor has been chasing you, and so they have a great relationship with you, and it's more important to you that you land with them because they know what to do with your book than that you get a big advance. Those are two really great outcomes to have, and the money involved in them could vary wildly. And it also depends on what the book is, and and again, where we see it on the shelf and who the audience is.
But if you do want to quit your job and you want to pay your mortgage or rent or buy groceries with earnings from your book, get yourself an agent. No, I mean, it sounds so basic, but there are people, there are such things as professional writers, who make their living by their pen. And that's a different, it's a very serious thing. And they approach their work with that seriousness, because there is no salary from, say, a university that's coming in every month, right? And there, a good literary agent is frankly necessary in this modern world too, if you have to take care of your family and yourself.
Well, I think we can wrap up there, but I want to say for sure, if you haven't watched many of our previous webinars, you can look up the Authors Guild on YouTube, and the Business Boot Camps for Writers series is there. The first one in the series is the path to publication, traditional and small presses, and that lays out a lot of the basics if you want to review those in more detail. But thank you so much to all of our panelists. This has been great. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming to talk to us. This is a great conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.